Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Environmental Science. I'm excited to see everyone who is coming on back. Give it just a second for everybody to sign in. I'm going to go ahead and open up the chat. And once we're coming in here, awesome. Hi, everyone. Hi, Zoe. Let me know if you can hear me okay. Hopefully everyone has had a relaxing weekend and is ready. Hi, Julia, ready to learn some environmental science. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. See if that's working for us. All right. Whoa, I think I made things crazy. Hold on. Let me fix that real quick. All right, there we go. Better, not as crazy. All right, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to start us off here with a poll. I can only do 4 options in the poll, so I couldn't include everywhere. So if you are not in the US, I do have to apologize for this. In this poll, I am curious where we are all located: Northwest, Southwest, Northeast, or Southeast. So go ahead and vote on that, on where you are. The reason I'm asking is because it's an absolutely beautiful day today here in Montana, which it is usually very cold. So I was just curious where everyone else is, and if it's a beautiful day there as well. I think it's actually 50 degrees out, which is a Montana summer. We're ready to go outside in shorts when it's 50. So I'm going to count myself in the Northwest. I know it's like hard to describe where you are in just those 4. We got some Southeast people. So people from the Southeast probably think that I'm crazy for thinking that 50 degrees is summertime, but it's not negative. So we're really excited about that. All right. And just a heads up, like always, if you comment in the chat, we can see your username. So if you don't want us to see your name, you can use a pseudonym and change it so that it is not your actual, name. So again, if you don't want us to see your name, just go ahead and change it. As always, please follow us on our social media platforms to stay tuned with what we are doing and the next upcoming events, which brings me to our next slide and our next upcoming events. Our next stream is actually fairly soon. It's in 3 days, and we're going to go over Unit 3 populations. So I will see you guys again very soon. And I wanted to announce, we didn't go over this last time, but trivia. Trivia is a live event, so you do have to be there at that exact time. Those are East Coast times. So if you are not on the East Coast, you are going to have to do that tricky math to figure out when it would go on for you. But yeah, those are East Coast times, and please join us so that we can go over what we learned. And these questions they do go over what we went over in the stream, but they're also a little bit more encompassing. So they're going to be questions on some stuff that you might run into on the test that I didn't cover. So the good thing about that is if you run into a question and you're like, man, I have no idea what that is about, that is a good way for you to study, right? If you run into something that you have no idea what it is, go back and check that out. All right, so that is our trivia. For today, we just did our intros, and then we're going to jump right into biodiversity. We're going to go over ecosystem services, island biogeography, ecological tolerance, natural disruptions to ecosystems, adaptations, and ecological succession. And I know ecological succession is what we voted to maybe talk the most about. this time, so we will definitely spend the majority of our time kind of talking, well, not the majority of our time, but we will focus on that one a little bit more than the other ones. So, all right, so let's jump right in here to an introduction to biodiversity. There are many varieties of ways we can measure biodiversity and its importance to an ecosystem health. These include genetic, species, and habitat diversity. Genetic diversity is when you look at like one specific species. So let's look at this picture here for a second. Those little orange fish are called peach anthus. And so if you were going to look at the genetic diversity of the peach anthus species, you'd want to see, how much difference of genetics those orange fish have from each other. And that would be then looking at their genotypes, right? Their phenotypes are fairly similar. It's very difficult for us to tell one of those orange fish from another. They're they look very much alike. But so we would want to look at their genetics. Well, how different are the genetics of those little orange fish? Now, the longer a species is in an area, happy and reproducing, having a lot of, what do they call it, generations, then there are more potentials for adaptations to occur, just because there's more potential. Every time you have a new generation or new babies, there's more potential for there to be like a mistake in the genetics, and that would lead to like a mutation. And sometimes those mutations are advantageous. So it takes a long time. If you're just waiting for like every little fish is having baby fish, and then every once in a while someone has a little baby fish that has like this weird fin, and that weird fin makes it better adapted to live in its environment for whatever reason. Maybe the other fish think it's really attractive, or maybe other fish are afraid of it so that it can stay alive, something like that. So it takes a very long time for those adaptations to occur and to build that genetic diversity within that one specific species. And it, sorry, let me go back. Oh man, I'm the worst at that. Okay, so it does take a really long time for that to build up. And it depends on the species, right? Because we just have a picture of a panda. So if you're talking about pandas, right, they have like one baby every 5 years. And the potential for a mutation that's going to be advantageous to happen is really low. Like it's like their genetic diversity is going to take forever to build up. But these little fish, every time they reproduce, they're going to be laying like 300 eggs. So they have a much higher chance of building that up. And I did see in the chat someone asked like which species has the most genetic diversity. Well, we don't know that. We'd have to look like very in depth at every single species. So, but things that would make it have a higher potential for genetic diversity would be that fast reproduction. And then any species that just has like more potential for mutations in their reproduction too. So again, that's what genetic diversity is. Now let's jump out to species diversity. Now we're looking at this ecosystem. Look at this picture again, kind of as a whole. Species biodiversity is how many different species exist in that one ecosystem. And that's what species biodiversity would be. So in this one, man, if you're even trying to count here, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different, maybe 6 different species of fish that I can see swimming around. If you really looked closer, you'd probably see like close to like 7. So there's a really high species diversity in this picture. And that was just the fish. If you look at the different types of coral, there's probably like 4 or 5 different types of coral just in this picture as well. So that's a really high species diversity. And we're going to kind of talk more about how that is important for the health of an ecosystem. But again, that's kind of how that's measured. So first we looked at one species and the genetics of that one species. And then now we looked at an ecosystem and the amount of different species in that ecosystem. And then finally, habitat diversity would be looking at kind of like a wider look at this outside of this picture here, how many different types of habitats exist in any sort of given area. So you could look at like the entirety of the US, and there's a lot of different habitats, in the US. So we have like very dry deserts. We have like Death Valley is the hottest place on earth, right? So it's like really dry and hot. And then we have like rainforests where the redwoods are in like Oregon and Northern California area. And then we've got like the bayou right? Super humid, hot, wet area. Really cool animals can adapt to live there. We have temperate forests. And then we have the Great Plains, mountains. So just in the US, there's a ton of different habitat diversity. And those different habitats lend different organisms to evolve there because they're so different. Like the same critter couldn't exist in the Pacific Southwest, where it's really hot, that could exist in the bayou, right? That would drown. So very different habitats lead to that different habitat diversity. And so again, we're going to talk about like how that keeps these organisms alive, because if habitats change, maybe an organism could go live in a different one, or it's, let's say with an example of habitats changing, let's just use climate change. As things get hotter, the desert might be unbearable and things can't live there anymore. But here in Montana, it would probably just be a few degrees warmer and it would be quite nice. So that's kind of why it's important that you have habitat diversity, because if everywhere was the same temperature and it got really hot everywhere, then everyone would just be too hot, dry out. But those different habitats make it so that some animals can just move, like birds might be like, man, it's too hot here, let's go to a different place. But not everybody can move, but some can. And then they'd be able to live in those different habitats and they wouldn't go extinct or be damaged. Let's see. And then just this, I feel like this question always comes up on the test, like which, and this would have been like we went over it last stream, but the habitat with the greatest biodiversity, throw that in the chat if you can think of that. The habitat with the greatest biodiversity. That would be the coral reefs. That's why I picked that one up there. But so that, I feel like that question is always in the test. All right, moving on. Talking about genetic diversity and why it matters. A population with a large genetic diversity would have a much greater chance at surviving environmental change or pressures like a new disease. A large amount of potential phenotypes would mean there's a greater possibility that one would be advantageous in new conditions. So I put pictures of corn here. The picture on the right is what like wild corn looks like. It's really pretty. Comes in different sizes, all different colors. It's very diverse. So kind of going back to what we learned in bio, genotype and phenotype. Remember, the genotype starts with a G, so that's your genetics. You can't see that. Having a lot of different genotypes would mean that there are probably different phenotypes, which is remember the P is physical features that are expressed. So those different phenotypes mean that maybe they'd be able to survive different things, and that environmental pressure could be things like maybe it's really hot out now, or maybe there's a new disease. And if every one in that species was genetically identical, then they'd probably all die of that new disease if no one was stronger than anyone else. And so that's why my other picture there is a picture of farmed corn. A lot of times the corn that we grow is genetically identical, and that is either corn like sweet corn that we eat. That corn would probably not be genetically identical. However, the majority of the corn that you see growing, if you ever do a road trip through the center of the US, then you're going to see a lot of corn growing, and that is usually genetically identical. It's actually probably a GMO that's been copyrighted, and those plants, every single one is the exact same plant, unless there was some accidental breeding with corn that was different from like a farm next door. But for the most part, that is genetically identical. So it's really, if a disease came that killed that corn, it would be disastrous. So it's important to have that genetic diversity to keep things a chance that someone would survive if there was a change. And so now we're going to look more at that species diversity. I saw someone ask like what species has the lowest, we go back, which species has the lowest diversity. The one that for the most part is used as an example the most is going to be cheetahs. So cheetahs are on the endangered species list. They are not doing well. And, they're actually fairly easy to breed in captivity. We can get their numbers up. The problem is their genetic diversity is so low. They went through a bottleneck event because of being hunted for like their pelts and stuff, their skin. So that there were so few of them that now the ones that have come back are genetically unstable. They're really, so technically speaking, cheetahs have a mutation where their sperm does not, it's damaged. It can't swim normally, so they can't like reproduce on their own. So cheetahs functionally are going to be like extinct here because their genetic diversity is so low that they're all sick basically with this issue of reproduction. So we can reproduce them in zoos just fine. So like they're going to be around in zoos, but for the most part, they are not going to be able to survive on their own anymore. And then never published our results of our first poll. I'm going to archive that. I want to make sure I don't skip any of our poll questions. All right, moving forward. Species diversity. In the same way, an ecosystem with a large diversity of species would have a greater chance at one of those species surviving a large environmental change. Scientists measure the number of different species in an ecosystem as species richness. So I'm looking at that picture of all those seashells. If that is, and all of those represent different organisms in an environment, that ecosystem is going to be really healthy because no matter what kind of happens to it environmentally, as long as it's not like some huge disaster, one of those species is likely to be able to survive through whatever happens, and you're not going to have like a total die-off. So let's say, if you're just looking at those shells, let's say there's a large volcanic eruption and the sand is no longer white, but it is dark, like black, because it's new rock from a volcano. Then all of those little critters that are like dark black colored are going to be able to survive. So the majority of the brown ones and the white ones, let's say they go extinct because they're easy for predators to find them, but all of the little ones that are dark colored are able to survive and reproduce and grow and take over in that ecosystem. So that is just an example of how species diversity within an ecosystem is going to allow that ecosystem to continue to survive no matter what happens to it, whether there's like a natural disaster type thing or a disease or something like that. And specialist species are the first to be lost when ecosystem disturbances occur, as they are not as adaptable as generalists. So let's kind of look at the vocabulary there. Specialists are organisms that eat just one thing. They can only live in one area. They can only tolerate a very low temperature change. Often animals that live on islands are specialists because they had to adapt to a very small ecosystem, right? So like if you are a lizard that adapted to live on an island, maybe you only eat one type of food because that's all there is there. And so you've adapted to just eat that thing and that's all you know how to do. And then if that food's gone, well, you're gone. So oftentimes specialists are not able to handle environmental changes. And a panda is an example of that. They can only live in very specific areas. They only eat one food. They don't reproduce very fast. They are not very good at surviving change. And that is why they are endangered. Generalists, on the other hand, are good at adapting to change. So that would be like a pigeon. You know, they'll eat anything. They don't care if it's cold or hot. You know, you can find them on the equator or they live in Chicago. And so like they're an example of a generalist. So they would be able to adapt to those changes and they'd be a good organism to have in an environment that was going to, you know, be able to survive and continue on. All right, so now let's actually before we go over there, let me see if I've got a question for us here. All right, so I do have a biodiversity question for you, and I didn't specifically cover it. So this one is going to see if you have covered it in class or not. So which of the following measures the number of species present and the relative abundance of species present? I'm going to open this poll. Which of the following measures the number of species present and the relative abundance of species present? Take just a second to answer that one. Ooh, all right, let's publish our results. I think I got you guys on this one. I tricked you. It's Shannon's index. So 7% of people said that. Yeah, Shannon's index takes a look at both the number of species and the relative abundance. So like, what does that even mean? Okay, the number of species. So let's say we are looking at a savanna and we can see that there are elephant, giraffe, and zebra. So there are 3 species, right? But when we look at it closer, like there are, let's say, there's 1 elephant and 1 giraffe and what else did I say? Zebra, and let's say 20 zebra. So the Shannon's index is going to be fairly low because the relative abundance of those different species is not very high. So if you look at that like in a much higher scale, if you're looking at like an entire savanna ecosystem, if there's 20,000 zebra and 10 elephant and like 2 giraffe, that ecosystem is not going to have a very high Shannon's index. It's not very diverse overall. But if it was like 30%, 30%, and 30% of all of these different animals like equally distributed, then it would have a much higher Shannon's index and be a much more diverse ecosystem overall. So that's kind of what that means, is taking into account those 2 different factors. Right, let's see. I'm going to do one more poll here for us really quick, one more quiz on that last information. The relative dominance of each species in an ecosystem is... One more second with that poll. All right. Go ahead and close that one. So we're kind of split. Definitely have a little bit more in species richness. The correct answer is species evenness. The relative dominance of each species in an ecosystem is the evenness. So think about that word evenness, and the dominance of each species. Is there an even amount of each species in that ecosystem? That's kind of how you can remember that one. Cool. Okay, let's move forward. Ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are any of the benefits humans receive from the natural world. I have a picture of our bee there because it is the most famous example of an ecosystem service. Bees naturally pollinate trees, and that is what causes fruit to grow. Think of like every fruit you've ever eaten. So let's like break that down. Like what even is a fruit? So like any fruit or vegetable that has like seeds in it would have had to have a flower. So when we talk about like what's a fruit and what's a vegetable, that's really nutritionally defined by the amount of sugar in it. But as far as like biologically defined, anything that has seeds in it would have had to originally have been a flower that was pollinated by a bee. So think about like everything you've ever eaten that was like a fruit or a vegetable that had seeds in it. And that would have had to have been pollinated by a bee. It's crazy, right? So like that, they do that for free for us, which is really kind of them. And if we had to like sit there with a Q-tip and pollinate all of these flowers ourselves, that would be like astronomically expensive. Like every apple would be $20 just because you had to pay someone to do that. So yeah, anyways, that's what bees are like the most famous example of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services fit into 4 major categories: provisioning, And those are products that are provided. Examples would be wood from forests or food from animals. Regulating, so that's maintaining processes like climate regulation of cycling of CO2, so like the natural cycle of photosynthesis. Cultural benefits, non-material benefits, so that is like recreation or emotional. That's why I have that picture down there in the bottom. We like a nice view, looking at traffic and smog makes us feel sad, and that's just kind of part of being human. We like to see green, we like to see blue skies. It makes us happy. So that is the cultural benefit of the ecosystem. And then supporting, that allows for other services to exist. So like nutrient cycling and primary production. So again, that's the photosynthesis would be the production of food for us, or that would help to then add to provisioning for wood from forests or from animals, either like wild animals, or we need photosynthesis to occur for us to grow corn to feed cows so we can harvest cows. So in general, ecosystem services is anything that the environment kind of does for us for free. And often on the test, this is going to be like in the FRQ section, and it will say like, how are humans, what is a way that humans are potentially damaging an ecosystem service, and then how is that going to affect us in the long run? So it's usually two parts. So like humans would be, by cutting down forests, we are naturally throwing off climate regulation by the natural cycling of CO2. So that would kind of be the different steps that you would need to say there. Or by using pesticides on farms, we are dramatically reducing bee populations, which then we don't have bees to pollinate our farms and our foods as a result. So try to think of this not necessarily as something that you need to like memorize, but like two steps. So like, how are humans affecting each one of these areas? Maybe have like an example for each one that you're ready with. So how are humans affecting it? We can do the cultural one. Humans are urban sprawl is growing out from cities. We're building so many houses and permanently destroying natural habitats, which then makes us sad because we can't go hiking or see natural habitats. We are stuck in these urban sprawls of city streets, and that makes us sad. So, try and think of two ways, or I guess think of how we're doing something, and then what is the result of that on us as well. All right, so we're moving right along here to talk a little bit about islands. Make sure we didn't skip any of our next polls. Yeah, okay. Island biogeography. Islands present a unique environmental challenge. Species are often specialists due to the lack of variety of resources and are therefore at great risk of extinction if that environment is altered. So there's our little picture of our tiny little island, and the organisms that evolved to live there are highly specialized to live on just that island and often cannot survive if they are removed or if something bad happens on that island. Islands are typically colonized over long periods of time. Oftentimes birds play a vital role in depositing nutrients and seeds on the island. And animals tend to arrive by chance, and this often creates a new species due to their isolation. So here, look at our pictures a little bit and kind of break down what we talked about here. So islands are colonized over a long period of time, and we mean a long period of time, because as that island kind of like erupts out of the sea, it is just going to be rock, and it's not going to have anything growing on it. Nothing can live there, and that's why seabirds really like it, because there are no predators there. So oftentimes these isolated islands out in the middle of the ocean where there's nothing there, thousands of seabirds will all go there at the same time, and they'll be all crammed together, and that's where they have their babies. And there's no predators, and it's a really nice way for them to reproduce. And when they're there, they are pooping on the island. And so they are depositing that nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus that we remember that plants really need. Oftentimes then those birds either deposit seeds through their poop, or they have seeds attached to their feathers that fall off on the island different ways. Sometimes seeds would land on an island from the air. They fly there in the air and land on the island. So really, though, we're talking about chance things happening. But over time, some seeds fall onto the island, and there is enough bird poop for them to grow. And then as that plant would grow and then die, and its body would then contribute to more soil growing. And then over time, you would have a base of soil, and then you would have plants be able to grow there. And then once you have a lot of plants growing, then if a lizard that got blown out to sea in a freak accident of a storm happened to land on that island, he might be like, oh, this is great, I can totally live here. And then over time evolve to be a unique species to that island. So all of those things we just talked about are like crazy chances happening over long periods of time. But that is how islands are colonized by animals. And then, so let's say like humans come along and we land there with our ship, and then like a bunch of rats that are generalist species come onto the island. They are able to eat everything in sight. They reproduce really fast, and they could just completely destroy all of the very unique organisms living on that island that took forever to evolve and adapt to that specific space. Could be just completely destroyed by an invasive species. And there are definitely documented cases of this happening. Cane toads are an example of an invasive species that has taken over many different islands, like in Hawaii, and as well as like domestic chickens, cats. Cats are horrible invasive species because they just eat everything. Sometimes they just kill stuff for fun. And then they reproduce really fast. They're really adaptable. They can live in freezing cold places or really hot places. So cats are horrible invasive species. But yeah, so that is in general island biogeography. And again, with anything with environmental science, you want to think about like how is this? So like I understand this information we just talked about, but like how is this going to appear on the test? So always think about like what is the natural process? How have humans messed it up? And then how does that in turn affect humans? So like the natural process, we kind of talked about how islands are formed like that. How have humans messed it up? Well, we introduced invasive species. We went and then we like cut down all the trees on the islands, to build our giant hotels. And, so that's kind of how humans have messed it up. And then in turn, kind of how does that affect humans? Well, like in this island specific example, like we've destroyed natural occurring ecosystems on islands, and now that's detrimental because we've lost those species. It makes us emotionally sad because we've lost original ecosystems that we can never get back or are very difficult to get back. And so we've kind of damaged it for next generations that can't experience that. So always kind of think of environmental science in those terms. What was there naturally? How did we mess it up? And then how does that affect us? And, in addition to the organisms that originally lived there as well. And just one more thing, we are going to talk about ecological succession, which is, again, what we kind of wanted to be our main topic. And so that whole process we just talked about is primary succession. And we'll go over like why that's what it is, but that's a really good example of it. Okay, ecological tolerance. Ecological tolerance is the range of conditions, temperature, salinity, available water, so like any environmental conditions that an individual organism or a species can tolerate before it dies. So when you talk about ecological tolerance, you can talk about it in like two windows, I guess. So you could talk about it for like a individual, like that polar bear, what can he tolerate before he dies? Or as a species, like what can all polar bears tolerate before they die? And again, we talked about like how some animals can tolerate a lot of things, like cats or pigeons, and some cannot. Some like literally 1 degree difference is going to be the end of their world. And that's polar bears. They have to have sea ice in order to hunt. They are adapted to go out on the sea ice and hunt seals that are having their babies. So the seals need the sea ice in order to reproduce. So as soon as it freezes over, the seals actually kind of like carve a hole using their teeth. So they have like a little like air hole that they can pop in and out of. And then they go up on the ice and have their babies. And the polar bears track them down, and it's like flat ice, right? So you're going to be able to see this giant bear coming and dive into the water. So they have to be able to hide from the seals and sneak up on them. And they are really adapted to doing that. That's why like their eyes are really high up on their head, so they can like kind of like scoot up, I guess, to find the seals. Anyways, if it goes up 1 degree, we know, remember from like our general chemistry or earth science classes, water freezes. And 1 degree of difference would mean water melting, right? So if we heat the earth up to a point where it is no longer below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then it's not going to freeze, right? So sometimes we talk about climate change being only 1 degree, and you're like, well, I live in Montana. 1 degree sounds great if it was 1 degree warmer. Well, 1 degree meaning that there's not going to be any more ice for the polar bears. They can't hunt, and they are going to go extinct. And that's, same thing with those seals. They're not going to have any ice for having their little babies. So some species, again, their ecological tolerance is very low. They can't handle it. And some really can. They'll be fine. So other species are not going to be harmed by large changes. They can adapt and deal with it. And so environmental conditions can change due to natural or man-made causes. Genetically diverse generalist populations tend to have a higher tolerance for change. So again, let's break that down. Genetically diverse. So if they have like a bunch of potential of genes, so that's their genotypes, that can cause different phenotypes, their physical features, they have a higher chance of surviving, right? Because if they, let's say the environment changed in some way, that they have the probability of having different organisms look different that could live in that new environment, then that would have a higher chance of them surviving. And generalists are, like we talked about, the pigeons, have a higher chance for tolerating that change. And then these two words here, this is always tough to remember. So you're going to have to try and think of like, what's your best way of memorizing things? Because, man, I hate it when two words look very similar and they pretty much mean very similar things. That's always a challenge. So we got to make note cards here on this one, try and come up with a saying to help look at these two different words, but definitely star this in your mind as something you got to know the difference between these two things. Resistance is the ability of an ecosystem or a species to survive a disturbance. And resilience is the ability of a species to bounce back after that disturbance. So like what? These are like the same words and the same idea. But resistance, so let's look at our forest here. How likely is it for that forest to catch on fire? That's your resistance. So if you have a Southern California forest and it's extremely dry, it's going to have a low resistance to catching on fire. High probability that it would catch on fire. But if you look at like a forest maybe on the coast in Oregon, that would have a pretty good resistance to catching on fire. It's probably not going to, right? So think of it that way. So resistance is like, I'm not going to get hurt. And then resilience is after you get hurt, can you bounce right back, or are you just done forever because you can't handle it? So the resilience, if any of you live in Southern California or in the Southwest, and nowadays really anywhere on the West Coast, and you have seen a forest fire aftermath, it is absolutely crazy. I know we oftentimes hear about fires in the news, but they don't ever really show or depict like how fast it comes back, and it is insane. So if you, and I used to live in Southern California too, that's why I've seen this before, but if you have a fire go through, literally the next time it rains, it will look like this picture. So it'll be all burnt and black, and then it'll rain one time, and then it'll be covered in grass, little tiny plants will come back. all of the plants that look like they're completely dead, well, not all of them, but the majority of the plants that look like they're completely dead like this, their roots were fine. So they'll just grow right back, like little leaves. If you kind of like look really closely in this picture, you can see their little like leaves already coming back. So plants that looked like they were absolutely dead will, see if I can make this a little bigger for you too. No, I don't think that did anything. Okay, but if you look close, they just come right back. So that's a really high resilience. These plants that looked like everything was just destroyed, it'll come right back. So that is amazing too for ecosystems being able to recover from these different damaging events. And I do think I have a poll question for us here to take a break. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So let's open this poll. Organisms that have a high resistance and resilience tend to be endangered, invasive, able to adapt to urbanization, small and fast. Take another second to vote on that poll. So I like this question because a lot of times the questions on the test, there's going to be multiple right-ish answers, but a most correct answer. So definitely take your time in reading them and think about which one of these is the most correct, or if some of these are trying to trick me, because I tricked some of you. So organisms that have high resistance and resilience tend to be, the correct answer here would have been able to adapt to urbanization, so able to adapt to humans growing in. They also can be invasive. They can be small and fast. So those other two answers are not necessarily wrong, but they're not the most right answer that was listed. So invasive species aren't necessarily those two terms, but they probably are. They can be. So again, I like that one because the test often has tricky questions like that. So definitely take time. I'm a big fan of, thinking like, which one is it definitely not, and that kind of like helps you whittle it down to which one is the most correct. Okie dokie, let's keep going. All right, natural disruptions to ecosystems. Earth is constantly changing under natural long-term cycles that drastically alter environments. It can also experience sudden catastrophic events. These disruptions can have as much as an ecological impact as man-made changes. So I know a lot of times with environmental science and with the news and everything, it's like, oh, the humans are destroying the world. And we are kind of, but it naturally destroys itself sometimes. And that's also, like we say, like humans are destroying the world. We're destroying the world as it is right now. So we are changing what it is right now, but the earth is very adaptable and it is just going to have a new normal and change to, whatever we do to it or whatever natural disruptions happen to it. So natural things are as important environmental changes as man-made ones. So climate change, naturally, the climate changes due to volcanic eruptions, varying levels of greenhouse gases, but these are slow changes over thousands of years. So that's kind of the picture in the bottom, the last ice age. These things happen, 10,000 years, we're going to see, slow warming of the earth. And if you look at charts of man-made climate change, we're talking drastic change in the last 100 years. So yes, it has changed naturally a lot in the last 10,000 years. Humans have done drastic change in the last 100 years. So that's a little bit like some people say, well, it's naturally getting warmer from the last ice age. Well, yeah, you're not wrong. But that's not the most accurate way to describe what's going on with climate. Tectonic or geological processes, so large upheavals of land, creating mountains, the creation of islands, the isolation of land masses, sea levels changing, the amount of sea ice there is drastically changes the overall level of the oceans. So if the entire, the poles, the top and bottom of the Earth, are frozen, then that is going to mean that there is going to be a lot less free water, moving around. Same thing as if it all melts, there's going to be a lot more water. And then as it moves up and down like that, you have different pockets of water that are trapped or are, come into the land, creating new seas or creating isolated seas. So that's why you have like saltwater lakes. And that's places where the ocean was there, but then it dried up and became isolated. So you have like inland saltwater lakes now after that. And then sudden changes. So sudden natural changes to ecosystems. That's a picture of Katrina. So after that hurricane. Sudden changes cause major environmental upheaval and force organisms to either move or adapt. These would be volcanic eruptions, a meteor impact, earthquakes, fires, storms. So things that naturally occur but cause huge impact to organisms. If you look at Katrina, like if you were an ant, there's nowhere for you to live for a while. So you would either have to adapt. And on that example, ants really have adapted to floods like this. They all hold hands and float away together as like a giant raft of ants. So that's pretty cool that they can do that. But yeah, so organisms would have to adapt to these changes or die out. And that brings us to what does the word adaptation even mean, and what is that? So when environmental conditions change, a species must adapt or they will die out. And so that is a picture of a mammoth skeleton because they did not adapt well. They did not make it past the melting of all of the ice in the North Americas, and they did die out. There are still some ice age creatures that are alive that we don't even think about as ice age creatures, but like the California condor. Those were adapted to, they're huge, right? So these huge vultures adapted to eat dead megafauna, which would be like your dying mammoths and stuff, your giant sloth. So those organisms adapted and evolved in order to eat decaying megafauna. And then now they're the last of their kind pretty much. And so they are trying to hang on to an ecosystem that they are not really adapted to anymore. There's not giant animals decomposing for them to eat. So it's kind of interesting. A species encounters environmental pressures. The individuals that have advantageous phenotypes, again, physical features, will survive. The individuals will then be able to pass their genetics, their genotype, to the next generation. This is the process of adaptation. So that is what adaptation is. A physical feature that makes you survive in order to pass on your genes over time, making the next generation also look like you. That is adaptation. And let's look at some examples. These are really famous examples that might come up on the test, but these are peppered moths. They come in two varieties, like a white or a dark colored. The white colored was really prevalent until the start of the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal, and then trees were all covered in coal and very dark, and the dark colored moths were able to survive where the light colored moths died out. So that's an example of human caused that adaptation. The middle picture is a picture of stick bugs. So they have naturally adapted over time to look like sticks so that they can avoid predators. So that the ones that looked the most like a stick survived to reproduce, and then the babies looked more like sticks. And then over time, you have these crazy looking bugs that are very camouflaged. And then I included sea turtles because that's kind of an interesting adaptation happening right now. Sea turtles, oh man, I can't remember the exact number. I want to say it's 86. The number 86 comes up a lot in environmental science as well. It's the year that whaling became illegal. I want to say it's 86. So at 86 degrees, sea turtles, it might be 82. Don't quote me on that. Sea turtles become female. in the sand. So if the average temperature of the sand is, let's say, mid 80s or above, then it becomes a female sea turtle. And if it's below that, it's a male turtle, which is absolutely crazy. So with climate change, they are another one that's like 1 degree is going to make a huge difference. And then they're going to be like all females, and then they're not going to be able to be a species anymore because you need both males and females. But so can they adapt to that? And they would have to have a behavioral adaptation to go to a different beach. So they are going to have to go more south if they're like in Australia. You know, they're going to have to move to a different beach that has a cooler temperature. But sea turtles, as we know, are very stubborn, and they go back to the beach that they were born on. So that's an interesting animal to kind of follow as far as like a current adaptation. Are they going to be able to adapt and move to a different beach, or are they going to die out? All right, and finally here we are going to finish with ecological succession, and this kind of goes over what we've been talking about all together and how a whole ecosystem adapts to change overall. So when the environment experiences changes or disasters, it will inevitably recover and tends to follow the same predictable patterns. And so I have that picture of the fire again, and I have a picture of a like a parking lot that has come back, because there are 2 main types of ecological succession dependent on that. And we'll look at that again. So primary succession, the only thing, like the biggest thing you got to memorize between these two: primary, no soil. Primary succession has no soil. Secondary succession has soil when it starts. So those different disasters that we talked about are either going to cause a primary succession event or a secondary succession event based on soil. So primary succession is going to be like a volcanic eruption, geological change, like let's say a mountain erupts out of the ground and it doesn't have any soil, it's just bare rock. Or humans made a parking lot and that is just bare rock. This takes a long time to happen. So remember that process we talked about before with the birds on an island? Like essentially that has to happen anywhere that there's no soil. You have to have, in our little picture here on the bottom, the number 1 is just the bare rock. And then you have to have lichens start to grow. So these are very small. A lichen is actually half like a plant and half bacteria. And it grows on rocks. It's very small and scrubby. And if enough of it grows and dies, then you'll have kind of like a base for maybe moss to start growing. And then if enough of that grows and dies, you can have like some tiny little like weed type plants, very hardy plants start to grow and die. And then enough of them do that there's a base of soil for like some shrubs and then some trees and then some big trees. So that process is going to be the same no matter what. So let's look back here. In these 2 pictures, you're going to follow the same patterns of plants growing, no matter which one it is. So if you look at these 2 pictures, there's a fire, and then there's a parking lot. So the one with the fire is going to be secondary succession because the fire came through and killed everything, but there was soil. And on the other one, the parking lot, no soil. So that's primary. And in either one, you're going to have like little tiny plants growing first, grasses, and then maybe some like really hardy shrubs can start to grow. And then if those like shrubs decompose, then you can maybe have some trees coming in, small trees, and then large trees. So it's always going to follow that same pattern of growth. Secondary succession or fire, it's going to happen really fast. Like the first time it rains, you're going to have grass growing everywhere, you know, and then in 3 years, you're going to have little shrubs and baby trees. And then in 10 years, it's going to look like a little young forest with some nice trees. And in 50 years, you're going to have like a forest back. On the other hand, 50 years could go by in this parking lot and you could maybe have some grass growing. So it's going to take a lot longer to get that soil base built up in order to grow plants. But it's following the same process. It's just much slower in one of them in the primary succession. So I just clicked over to this just because this, the picture on the bottom here, that's a picture of lichen that main circle, and then the plants growing around it on the outside are mosses. So that's what lichen looks like when it starts to grow. It's a very hardy, scrubby little organism. And it is able to grow like right on a rock. And it does photosynthesis, and yeah, so that's like usually what starts to happen when plants come in. They do need some moisture in order to survive, though. Here, let's throw up a poll question while we're at it. We got just a few minutes left. Which of the following events would cause a primary succession event to occur? A fire, a farmer using a plow to till the land, the formation of a new island, or a large-scale flood? All right, I'm going to go ahead and publish our results for that one. For the most part, we were right on it. The formation of a new island is going to be your primary succession because it would not have any soil. Again, the only like indicator between the difference between primary and secondary is soil. Oopsies, go back. Okay, so this is our last slide we're going to go over. These are just some definitions that are important when talking about different ecosystems and looking at their health and their ability to recover. Pioneer species is a species that moves into an environment quickly after an upheaval at the early stages of succession. So any type of lichen or moss would be a pioneer species. Those birds on the island, those were a picture of gannets, actually. So those gannets that come in and like poop on the island and put nutrients there, that would be a pioneer species. Any organism that comes to a new environment at the beginning is going to be a pioneer species. Sorry about that poll. Let me get that out of the way. An indicator species, the health or presence of this species indicates the health of an environment, often a very sensitive organism that will die out quickly. So that's our little frog. Frogs breathe through their skin. And so imagine if like your lungs were just like, all over on the outside of your body, on your skin. And so like anything you touched, you would just like absorb into your bloodstream through your lungs. So if there's like any sort of pollutant or poison in the water, it just gets sucked into their bloodstream, poor little guys. So they are often an indicator species. They are often the first to die out if a ecosystem becomes polluted. And then a keystone species, this organism is vital for survival of other organisms or the entire ecosystem. So that is sea otter. Sea otters eat a ton. They eat urchins, and urchins eat kelp. So if you don't have sea otters, the urchin eat all the kelp, and then you don't have a kelp forest, and all the fish and hundreds of species that live there all die. And that's what happened when we killed all of the sea otters for their fur. We realized that the entire kelp forest and all the fish populations died. And so they are exactly that. They are a keystone species. We have to have them. When you put them back, the kelp forest comes back. And then all of the hundreds of species that rely on it. Same thing with wolves. We realized that when we took the wolves out of Yellowstone, it dramatically changed the environment. So there's actually a really cool video you could probably find on YouTube called How Wolves Change Rivers. And it talks about how when they put the wolves back into Yellowstone, it literally changed how the rivers flowed. And I'll leave it to you to go watch that video to see exactly how. It has to do with a lot of different species being affected by that. Okay, cool. So that is it for today. And again, I'm going to see you guys in just 3 days. We will be back together to talk about populations. But please continue the conversation. If you have not yet joined Discord, please do. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you so much for joining me. Oh, and in Discord, if there is something specific about populations you want to learn about, please let me know.